Welcome to OverBoost 22. OverBoost is a podcast interview series featuring discussions with speedrunners about their history in speedrunning and gaming and the runs they're passionate about. I am your host, PMC Trilogy, and with me today is MadMega. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
No, I'm really excited. So, as a little origin story, this podcast series really began out with a very, 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 very niche interest, which was mecha games, because I do some mecha games myself, and so that was the kind. I think when I first put you on my list of like prospective runners, it was like Metal Storm. Got to get around to talking about Metal Storm at some point. I like to start these off with some recent event conversation, and for you, I think one of the things I wanted to ask about was you had the opportunity to do I think your two runs back to back at SGDQ, and I just wanted to check in. How was that experience of being a part of the first fully online main event GDQ? Of course, there's been side events online before. But I wanted to see if you just sort of had any commentary to provide about that experience.
Honestly, it was great. I mean, I feel like as a speedrunner, at least the way that I came around into it, AGDQ always kind of felt like a very. It is the big stage, I think is what it is. The easiest way to say it is that in speedrunning, like that's the primary stage. That's where the biggest audiences, so to speak. So it's kind of viewed. I've always kind of thought of it as kind of like a major career goal for a speedrunner to be able to get up there and show the whatever game it is or games that you have that are most near and dear to you. And Metal Storm is one that's definitely been there for me. And getting to do two runs back to back. Getting to show off a Ghostbusters game, which is another one of my favorites, became one of my favorites. It was really cool in the middle of an NES block on a Monday that the schedule slipped, and I ended up, I think, in a much better viewing window as well. So it was really cool to be a part of. The only thing is, and I hate to sound kind of negative, but it's like I really wish that I'd been able to be there and have my friends be on the stage with me and have have a full couch and that whole experience, because for the online it felt kind of a little trimmed down, and I was afraid to have too many voices because the games weren't very long, and I think that when you can't see each other, it's hard to have those moments where a bigger couch could talk, but I only wanted to have one co-commentator for each. But it was a really good experience, and it's awesome to be able to show those off to a lot of people that probably don't know of Metal Storm, or even fewer who know of new Ghostbusters 2. So
yeah, no, it's hard to replace the sensation of being on a stage with people, and I think you brought up a lot of the points in terms of commentary. I definitely feel like I noticed that too, in that I think for an online event, not being able to see each other, it's much better to have fewer members of commentary. There were some runs that still really did it well, but I think those are usually longer runs too. So I think I definitely agree with your assessments. Before we move on to the history, background, and interrogation, I did want to ask. You sounds like you got two favorites of yours: new Ghostbusters 2 and Metal Storm into SGDQ. What's the next thing? If you had an automatic in and you could get any game you wanted, in fact, you may have already submitted it because AGDQ 2021 submissions just closed not too long ago. What's that game?
Well, I did not submit it this time. I actually didn't submit anything for this AGDQ. I elected, I got in, and this is another online event, and I kind of thought that maybe it was better. One of the cool things I think about it being an online event, real quick to diverge, not to ignore the question, but is that I think that it gave a lot of people opportunity to be a part of an AGDQ that weren't normally able to, because it is a live event and there's travel involved and there is a significant expense to all of that. So I kind of looked at it as like, I could probably offer another game or two that might get in there, but I'd rather not, even present a temptation to have that, and I can save that for another day. But the game I really want to get in is it's called Lucky Dime Caper, starring Donald Duck, and I have done that run at multiple events now. And it's an old Sega Master System game that I don't think was ever actually released in the United States. Same thing as New Ghostbusters 2. That was also never released in the United States. Somehow I find these games and they just speak to me. But it is, for some reason, that game just, I love it. It's got Donald Duck, and I mean, I like him as a character because he's just this angry duck, and you can't understand a word he says. There's just something charming about him. But the game is very precise, and a really clean run of it looks very, very easy. And I always kind of appreciate games that when you see them speedrun at a high level, it looks like it's the easiest game in the world. And then if you pick it up and you play it, you're like, wow, this is brutal. and I just, it's definitely one of my, it's another one of those games that has become one of my favorites, just from speedrunning it.
Cool. No, that's actually really, and I like too that in this case it feels like some of your speedrunning efforts are surfacing these games that didn't make it to North America, or when we talk about Metal Storm, that's a game that you were doing the re-release version, which is its own cool story that we'll get into maybe later when we dive into that game specifically. But let's get on track here. Let's go back to the very beginning, the foundation. Where does gaming start for you? Is it something you got from family, friends?
So I was thinking about this a little bit, and I think it goes back to like when I was in like preschool or kindergarten, and I had a friend back then, and his name is Joe, and I honestly haven't talked to this guy in like 15 or 20 years now, like since high school, but he had a Nintendo, and so like he was my best friend in grade school, and I was like, oh, Nintendo's so cool. So I'd go over to his place and we'd play Nintendo. So for like Christmas when I was 4 or 5, my parents finally caved, and I got the NES control deck, the big box that came with the 2 controllers, Super Mario, Duck Hunt, and the light gun, and my dad had to climb behind the TV and hook everything up, and I'm 4 years old or 5, I'm terrible at Mario, but that's the game that we had, and not long after that, I mean, I basically ever since then I've always had at least 1 or 2 consoles, and I've always been playing, pretty much since then. So it's been about 3 decades, I would say, of pretty solid, just video games at just about every stage of my life, everywhere I've been. So this is a pretty common sort of thing. You have that early holiday gift, and it translates from there. One thing I always like to ask is, at what point would you say that you really took ownership of it yourself? That it was no longer, because I think for me growing up, Christmas or birthday, I might get, two PlayStation games, 2 PlayStation 2 games, something like that. But then at a certain point, like going to college, I think the first system I really bought for myself was probably, in college again, when 18 would have been like 360. And so I'm curious for you, is there a certain point where you feel like, yes, I'm really in the driver's seat here in terms of going out and getting what I want? So that's kind of interesting. I think that for me it might have happened a little earlier than for a lot of people. So when I was younger, not to get super kind of like downer, I guess, but my parents got divorced, and so like after that happened, I was always big into video games, but that was always kind of an escape. And one of the things that after that happened is that the like allowance and being able to save up money and squirrel money away and that sort of thing. Because that's how I bought like Super Mario Brothers 3. I remember I like saved my allowances for like 3 months or something.
Yeah.
But once those things started to go away, like I had, you know, these games, but I basically played them and I was kind of done with them. So where we lived, I was able to like walk to. It was before GameStop. I don't remember even the name of the place. I think it was a different chain at the time.
Was a Funkoland or a Babbage's or an electronics boutique?
Yeah, it wasn't even one of those. It was just I think like a third party shop, and so I would take some of these games and I'd trade them in, and once I got a little older, even, you know, once I was in high school, even then I was always kind of making like deals with my dad, basically like, okay, well, if I trade in my Sega that gives us X amount of dollars, and then, you know, I'll do that now and I'll give you that credit, and then for Christmas I'm going to get, you know, a Dreamcast or a PlayStation. I forget how like the progression went, but so like I was always trying to kind of keep up and with, you know, what most of my friends were playing at the time. And so I kind of had to, you know, adopt okay, well, as much as I'd like to keep my original Nintendo, you know, it's got to go for another purpose. So I'm unfortunately able to say that I think that most of the consoles that I have that I'm sitting in front of right now, I think only 1 or 2 of them are actually original machines that I've had, you know, since I was young.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, no, you anticipated that question because it sounds like then, of course, you know, you were trading and stuff, and you didn't keep things around, which is good and bad. You know, it depends. I feel like among my friends, there are the friends who take care of their stuff, and then there are the friends who are like I don't know, like somehow emit a field that just slowly decays things around them, and so. You know, like somehow they have the NES that has, you know, the front swinging plate removed and all the other pieces that can be removed, and somehow it's loose. It doesn't actually fit together, the shell, like it should. You know, but then some people have it in pristine condition or something, you know, so I sometimes it might be, like I certainly feel, like I you know, for me, the first one I saved it up for was PlayStation 2, but that PlayStation 2 went through some rough times, and I do not have that PlayStation 2. And now I get to use my my girlfriend's childhood PlayStation 2, which I will tell you is in much better condition. I'm glad I'm using that one.
Yeah, it's funny. I think the N64 I have is actually I think it's my little sister's, and she never really played it. And when my dad was, you know, after my little sister moved off to college, he's like, well, we have this thing. I have no use for it. I was just going to get rid of it. I was like, don't you dare do that. I will take that. I will put that N64 to good use.
Oh, also, I just realized I have to make an editorial note for anyone listening. At the time of recording, the statement I made was correct. By the time this podcast releases, I probably should have said my wife, because we're getting married next week. But that is neither here nor there. Just in case, you know, that'll be announced soon. Pandemic wedding. It's not quite as big affair as, you know, we'd like it to be, but that's you know, that's 2020 for you.
Yeah, that's this year for sure.
Yeah, no, that is 100% this year. So here's another question then, which is, and this is something that surprises me because I am very much, I feel like for much of my life with games have been very single player centric. And I think by their nature, speedruns are typically single-player centric experiences. You have some co-op stuff, things like that, but typically single-player games is what you're looking at. And I still find that people find a lot of time, or at least have had phases, where they've been very much into big multiplayer games. Certainly the past 2 decades, you know, I think you saw the rise of internet gaming, which has enabled all sorts of things, you know, matchmaking through MOBAs, first-person shooters, or MMOs. Did you have any big phases with big multiplayer games?
I would say that I definitely did. It's been kind of in weird bursts, I guess would be the way to say it. For the longest time, until really I got into speedrunning at all, I've always been big single player focused, anyways. But I'd say that the tail end of the original Xbox, when Halo 2 and Xbox Live were a thing, I played that pretty extensively, but even then it was less friendly from an ease of access point, I think, than... I mean, once the 360 came out, to me, that just changed everything in terms of being able to play online. And also it didn't hurt that, you know, I was in college at the time, and when Halo 3 dropped, I mean, that was just all we did. I mean, we'd go to class, do like the minimal amount of homework possible, and then it was just Halo time. And we played a lot of Halo, and then that led to, you know, like some Call of Duty. And, you know, even now I'll still play, I still think that Halo is probably my favorite, like, online shooter. Like, if I'm not streaming, which I admit I haven't been doing as much of as I should lately, but if I'm just like trying to have like 20 minutes or an hour where I'm just relaxing, like a lot of times I'll fire up you know, Master Chief Collection, I'll play some Halo. And one of the few ways that actually I've been able to maintain contact with some of my buddies this year, we're pretty good about, you know, once a week we'll get together, we'll play Rocket League, and, you know, instead of, you know, what we'd normally do, which is like Saturdays, we'd hang out at each other's house and, like, you know, hang out and you know, shoot the breeze or whatever. Now it's Thursday nights, we'll get together on Halo and have a few beers and just chat and play carball. So it's been a nice side way of maintaining relationships this year, especially. But yeah, I mean, I do enjoy multi games. It's never something I feel comfortable streaming, I guess, is the reason why you'll probably never see it there from me.
No, I think that's a really good answer. I think it's interesting to me in terms of this podcast and asking speedrunners this question. I feel like the two things I've gotten are either what you just said, which is maintaining the social connection, or I think you'll see that some runners, you know, they have a deep drive to be competitive, and, you know, and so going to things where they can get a ranking like League will scratch an itch in the same way that competing on a leaderboard might scratch that competitive itch. So, you know, I shouldn't have been surprised, but, you know, there we are. Multiplayer games still pretty important. But let's talk about speedrunning. I think you hinted what the answer to this is, but what's your first exposure to speedrunning?
Well, so I think that, you know, I think it's been about 5 years now. I tried to speedrun maybe about 5 years ago. I forget the exact year, but I remember that something that I haven't seen these that much after GDQs recently, but I know that for a while there was it was called a Get Yourself Speedrunning series, and the year that I really just kind of fell in love with watching it was a year that one of the Get Yourself Speedrunning games was Mega Man 2. And I've always been a huge Mega Man fan. That was always my favorite, you know, game on the NES when I was a kid, that series. And so I was like, oh, perfect. This is an opportunity to, you know, kind of dive into this thing that I've really enjoyed watching on Twitch. Like I found YouTube and I found Twitch, and then it led to the GDQ, and then it's like, hey, you can teach yourself how to do this. And I was like, oh, cool. And I tried to do that, and I can say that I'm very glad that the earliest VODs are not accessible. I did not have the computer hardware to be able to do it. It was just a mess in terms of presentation, like just choppy, because I was trying to play on like a Wii U, like trying to capture that with a computer that was in no way powerful enough to handle like an HDMI connection in, and so it looked really, really subpar. And then, you know, and I was in the tournament for the Get Yourself Speedrunning, and I did, you know, I guess fine. And I was like, okay, that was fun. And then I kind of stopped for about a year, and then AGDQ rolled around again, and I was like, oh, this is cool. Maybe I'll try that. And there was a Mega Man 3 tournament. You'll see a theme, especially in my early going, that is very Mega Man centric. And I was like, oh, cool, I'll learn Mega Man 3. And so I did that. And all of this, mind you, is being done. I'm playing these old retro games on a 55-inch LED TV in my basement that is not designed to have composite input. So
right.
So I'm dealing with, and what I come to realize, years later, and at the time I didn't quite know this, is that a big problem that you have with retro games is if you have lag, especially variable lag, which is what you get if you go on Amazon and you buy a composite to or a composite to HDMI converter, like a little $10 job on Amazon, and you use that, you can kind of play your game and it's going to be fine. But if you're trying to be really precise, you're just going to die a lot because the frames displayed on the screen are not the same that's actually going on in the hardware at the time. And so I didn't know any of this, and so worked really hard to try to be somewhat competent at Mega Man 3, and it turns out that one of the reasons why I was having trouble is that I couldn't develop reliable visual cues or audio or really cues of any kind. I was just I had to play very safe no matter what I was doing. And it was around that time where I was like, okay, I'm gonna start taking this seriously. I'm gonna try to do this for real. And I got a proper CRT television that I'm sitting in front of now. It's a pretty nice PVM that I've got here, and I kind of went all in on the retro thing, and those were the games that really got me started. And then once I got comfortable with that, I branched out more, and I've kind of played a bunch of retro garbage all over the place, I guess is the best way to say it. Now if you look at my library on speedrun.com.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is a good tangent to get into, because I'm very, very curious about this. Because I feel like this is one of those things. I'm going to say playing older video games generally right now. The hardware for connecting, what TV. How do you connect to the TV? How do you capture? So I heard you say PV. How heavy is yours? That's more than how much did it cost? How heavy?
It's not light. I think it's only a 14-inch screen, so it's not even especially large. But I think it's probably 30 pounds. It's heavy. I remember picking the thing up and I put it in the back seat of my car, and when I picked it up off the seat of my car after I got home, I look over and you can just see where the weight creased the leather in the back seat of my car, and I'm just like, well, I hope that rebounds, because otherwise that's there forever now.
It's never going away. So do you do all of your playing of older games on that TV? Do you have any other setups where you're still using a modern TV?
So the way that I tried to get my setup, it's taken a lot of iteration, but where it sits now is anything that was originally designed for playing on a CRT. So basically everything from, I would say, the original Xbox, PS2, Dreamcast generation and back, I do play on the PVM. And it just to give you an idea of the setup I have is, everything is based on S-Video, which for the especially retro consoles is perfectly good. It has more than enough bandwidth to handle you really can't tell a huge difference on RGB to S-Video for an NES, for example.
Yeah.
But so I have all of my CRT stuff goes to an S-Video switcher, and then that goes to a splitter that then goes into my capture card or to the TV, and that basically lets me keep everything hooked up all at the same time. And if I want to jump through different consoles, I can, which has come in handy. I've done a couple of races. RGLTV has done a couple of different races. Discathlon comes to mind, where I think there was an NES game, a Genesis game, a Super Nintendo game, and so I'm like, all right, I can do that. Just push a couple buttons, flip through, and now boom, here I am. I can jump between consoles really easily, which is nice for me, and I don't have to change stuff around. But it's been a real work in progress. I'd say it's been 3 years of pretty gradual update to that, and then all the modern stuff I have set up to output through an HDMI switch that I have. That actually the main computer screen that I'm looking at right now, I can change the input on that, and I can play my I have a Switch and an Xbox One 360 up here. PS4 will come up here eventually once I get a PS5. And be able to play those on stream. Though the newer stuff doesn't show up as often on my
sure.
page, but
sure. Well, no, that's interesting. I think one of the things I was curious about too is that I feel like the area in which there is like the most furious like concentration of money and sort of tinkering is attempting to hook retro consoles to modern TVs. Particularly, I always think people have like a certain way of talking about the OSSC, which makes me like deeply, deeply suspicious. Like I have no standards though. Like for me, the whole point of playing like a PlayStation 1 game is to try and cause as much to happen on the screen as possible, to kill of lag as much as possible. So like I am not the right person to be like, yes, I need this to be responsive. That has never been my goal, really. But it sounds like you've avoided that. You've really just decided, you know what, I'm going to make the effort to keep apples to apples and oranges to oranges.
Yeah, mostly. The way that I capture everything is via HDMI. I do have a RetroTink, which is how I output the consoles to my capture. My capture card is HDMI capture now.
What capture card is that?
I have it's a StarTech USB 3.
Okay, yeah. I've seen those.
It's honestly it's been really nice. And the reason I like it is that even if I didn't want to use the HDMI, it does still allow for composite component, S-video, all of those sorts of inputs are available too. But the way that I have it set up in my right now is that the original S-video signal goes to the PVM, but it's split a little bit before that, so that signal also goes to the RetroTink, and the RetroTink outputs that to be captured. And some of that is kind of like an idea of future-proofing, is that I know that there are some HDMI mods that exist, like especially for the NES, and it's like modding is something that I kind of dabble in, and I always enjoy like taking my consoles apart and fixing them at times. So knowing that that's a thing that exists, that it's like, okay, well, maybe if I can ever get my hands on one of those mod kits, I'll take my NES apart and I'll have an HDMI, straight HDMI NES, and that'd be fine for me. So,
all right, one you made me think of the other retro hardware question that I wanted to ask before we get out of this deep hole of money, which is, are you big into flashcards and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, yeah, I mean, you want to talk about money holes? I can. I mean, that's a pit, And the thing is that between Crix and Terra Onion and some of the other people that make these things, like you can just find massive ways to spend a ton of money on stuff. Like I have 2 different EverDrives for my Nintendo because the newest version is more powerful and it lets you play bigger games, period. Like ROMs that couldn't work on the original version now work on this one, so I have that. I have the newest EverDrive for the Genesis, which lets me play Sega CD games, which is something I've wanted to mess with a little bit. Even casually, there are a few games there on Sega CD that I think are really neat. Snatcher comes to mind. And so, like, there's a Super Nintendo and the N64, and it's honestly one of the reasons why I like the retro console or cartridge-based games so much to play in speedrun is that there's a lot of ability to, like the ease of access once you pay for that cart. And admittedly, that's, it's like, what's easier, like messing with the settings or having the flash cart, and once you get the ROMs, everything just works. For me, I found that the latter one is the easier one. Is a funny aside, like one of the runs I really like to watch you play is Die Hard Nakatomi Plaza, and I have that installed on the PC I'm talking to you on right now, and I can't get it to work the way I want it to work.
Yeah, you can message me about that later. That is actually all right. This is super quick, but one of the astounding things about that game is that initially me and Casey Frew were running the game using DXWND to make it launch more correctly. And what happened was that another runner, Cyanide, shout out to Cyanide, came along and started launching it without DXWND using a batch file and I think some sort of command line windowed option. And for whatever reason, that saves real time about 3 minutes of loads.
That's absurd.
I don't know why. It's weird. But I mean, that's life. That's old games. The other thing though, cartridge games, one thing that's been really interesting to me from a speedrunner perspective is that when it comes to submitting speedruns, it seems like, and my assumption is the technology bears this out to be correct, is that if you're using a cartridge-based EverDrive, you don't need to blink an eye about saying, I did a run of Shadows of the Empire in N64, and I did it on my EverDrive, but that's not important. It's still the same game, playing on original hardware, not a big deal. Is that correct?
Mostly, I would say it's mostly correct. I can't think of any games off the top of my head that don't that give you an issue if you play on an EverDrive. I know that there are some games that just don't work on EverDrive. For example, the Super Nintendo is famous for when it was released that companies would put extra chips in the cartridge that did different things. So, for example, Mega Man X2 and 3 has, I forget the name of the chip, but this chip basically created wire meshes that were 3D and could be manipulated by the SNES. And so that needs to be emulated as well in the flash cart. And so that's one that's been cracked, but there are others that sometimes don't work. So there's sometimes a limitation that just some games you can't play on an EverDrive, but for the most part, if it plays on an EverDrive, because of how it works, it at least my understanding of it is that you're really just turning the EverDrive into that game. It's just the data, it's just being pulled in, and so it's operating the same way.
Yeah, and so the point that I wanted to get to, just to have your brain on this maybe, is that of course, I sort of grew up as mostly a PlayStation monster, and so I love PlayStation and PlayStation 2. And we're in a period now where we're starting to see more and more optical disc emulators.
Mm-hmm.
We had GDMU for Dreamcast for a long time, but now, Terra Onion has mode which covers Dreamcast and Saturn, and apparently soon PlayStation.
Yeah, I
saw
same hardware. That. Very exciting.
There was SIO, which has been interesting for PlayStation 1, X-Station, which is coming soon.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah, and these have varying levels of complexity. Some of them are, the Dreamcast Saturn stuff is plug and play. PlayStation 1 apparently is just difficult to deal with and requires fine soldering always and forever.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one myself, actually. I have that purchased. Mm-hmm. I'm like, I can't wait to take apart my PlayStation and try to get this to work. Like, rubbing my hands together.
But of course, when it comes to optical drive emulators, you're talking about interfering or changing how the disk reading is going on, which I'm pretty sure you're probably going to change load times, probably. And you could also affect other things as well. I know with SIO, because it's coming through the parallel port, there's often issues with like CD audio stuff. There's been a lot of compatibility issues coming and going with that product. And so I just wanted to get your take on using optical drive emulators for speedrunning?
I mean, I'm generally I try to take a pretty liberal view of how you play your game, because to me the speedrunning and really until you get to a very, very high level on a particular game, I'd say that the person you're really competing against is yourself. And so if that means that, so to me, a level playing field, you really don't need to worry about it until you start to get into like really competitive or a group of people that have really decided that this is how we want to determine who among us is the fastest at this game. And so for those kinds of things, I mean, I love it. Not to mention the fact that, the Dreamcast, I'm looking at mine right now. I love the thing. It's a little brick. It's tough. But that disc drive, every time I play it, it sounds like it's going to die. It sounds like an old wheezy, like it just can barely make it through. And I cannot wait to replace it with the mode and just be like, all right, boom, here we go. We're going to play some Code Veronica and away we go, or some Sonic Adventure. And I think that you're going to lose those load times, but I think that, thinking long term, there's no way that everybody's going to be able to play on original hardware forever. These things are finite. There are only so many of them that exist, in the general sense as far as the consoles go. And as they fail, that number gets lower and lower. So as speedrunners, especially retro speedrunners, I do think that we need to be cognizant that, there will come a time where we're probably going to have to emulate everything. And that means, that gets crazy. But I'm anything that lets us keep the original hardware involved, to me, I like that. So I guess that's a very long way to answer and to say. No, like,
that's
where
the question is going, right? I mean, that's where it's going, which is, we're as people who like these consoles, we like these options because they allow us to preserve a part of the console while getting rid of the moving parts, the optical media failing, the disc reader failing, stuff like that. But, long term accessibility, really, it's going to be other things. It's going to be, either emulation like your normal PC emulators, or it's going to be emulation like, more powerful misters down the road or something like that, But no, I it's something I've been thinking about. I make notes about it sometimes. I went and looked at like the 50 most popular PlayStation 1 games that are speedrun to get a sense of what they look for in acceptable emulators. And I discovered there is no consistent through line through all of the communities.
No, there's a little more consistency, I think, on the really retro. When you start talking about like NES and Genesis and Super Nintendo, I think that there's a little more leeway there because we really do understand, by my level of it, we understand pretty well how to emulate those consoles. But I mean, they're also, the NES is, almost 40 years old now. When you really think about it. I think the NES was released in 84 or 82. So, we're not far away from 4 decades of the original Nintendo. So, it's not surprising that we have a really strong grasp on that and are able to mimic it, because how complicated can any of those chips in that thing be? Even something as relatively old as a PlayStation, there's some stuff in there that's pretty complicated. And it's harder to emulate, by my understanding. I'm not really a computer engineer on the level of dealing with chips and stuff, but my dabbling and understanding is that, it's just harder to mimic and emulate these things, in the same way that the original consoles did. And not to mention that, I think that you get into some very interesting things, because if you talk about PlayStation 2 gaming and speedrunning, you always want, I think it's the 9000 series, right?
The 90K.
Yeah,
the 90K.
And so, that's already like a factor to me that kind of is weird. It's like, okay, so we're looking at very specific versions of hardware for getting us the best times, so you're almost already skewing your user base, that they have to find this very specific unit that's very specific and has that only so many of those exist, and it's already hamstringing people that would like to get involved. And I don't think that should ever be that should never be something that off puts you from getting started. But if you if you want to be like a top end runner of, I'll just say like Crash Bandicoot. I don't really know PlayStation runs necessarily, but like or Mega Man 8 is a good example because it's a PlayStation 1 game. And, the load times are better on the PS2, and obviously they're best on the 90K. So, like, theoretically, if you want to play that on OG hardware, that's how you got to do it. And that can be a little off-putting, but, and these are the things I kind of worry about big picture from a hardware standpoint. Because, again, this stuff isn't getting any younger.
On that note, let's maybe ask another hardware-related question. Which is that speedrunning pretty, can be intensive, especially on your hands. Do you have any thoughts or approaches to health in terms of, your hands, preventative stuff, posture, things like that?
Preventative, I would say, is literally don't sit the way I do. Would be my first advice to anybody. But for me personally, I try to stay healthy otherwise. I try to run and exercise and that sort of stuff. And I think that's just this is like a weird thing I've noticed about myself, is that if I take like 2 weeks off and I don't exercise, and whether I'm trying to, play multi-Halo or trying to speedrun, I feel like I'm just not there. But then if I go back to it and I'm keeping up with my normal, like, regular exercise regimen, like, it feels like everything goes back to normal, and like I feel good about it again. So I don't know, like, necessarily if that's maybe just psychosomatic or if that's all in my head, but I definitely feel like as long as I'm trying to keep in good health, like, I feel like I have better control over everything. But the best and most obvious answer, I think, is especially depending upon the game you play, like hand stretches and that sort of stuff, like, really comes in handy. And don't overdo it. Like, this is especially true of retro games, I think, is mashing. And you can strain your shoulder, your elbow, your neck, your back, trying to mash a button. And that sounds crazy, but when you're literally trying to go for, like, 30 hertz or 20 hertz of input per second, you're really wailing on that controller. And if you have a bad form in doing it, you can like, crick your neck or whatever. So try to find a way to do it that's comfortable, and always, like, stretch and take breaks if you're playing something that's super mash heavy, like Contra or something like that, where you're really just going to town. And it's like, yeah, you know what? Every run, give yourself a minute, watch the intro video, and then try again. Like, don't overwork yourself.
All right, I want to get some rapid fire takes. Yes. What's your favorite speedrun of the ones you've done?
Of my speedruns?
Yes.
I mean, it might have to be Metal Storm. It's just, there's something about that game that is, it's really, really pretty looking when you do it right. And depending upon which category, it can look a little different, but to do everything right takes, where a lot of the things that you're doing are frame perfect and pixel perfect, and to get everything right on a run when you really nail it, just it feels really, really good. I also think that it's an interesting run to watch too. Like, I have plenty of games I think that I run that I would argue are kind of boring for a viewer. I don't think that Metal Storm falls into that. I think that Metal Storm is a game that, looks cool to watch, no matter how the run's going, really.
What's your least favorite speedrun of the ones you've done?
That's maybe a little harder. Because I've tried to not do games that I don't like. So a through line for most of my speedrunning catalog is games that I enjoyed as a kid that I decided to speedrun. And so I would say, and this is going to be blasphemous for a lot of retro runners, but I think it might be Blaster Master. I don't even have a time on the leaderboards for it, but I have done that speedrun, and something about that speedrun, I just do not. I like to watch it, especially people that are really good at it. It's a super cool run for me to watch, but when I play it, something about it, I'm just like, man, I don't like anything that goes on in this. I don't know if it's the controls. That certainly factors in, especially late game. But I think that there's a bunch of little, like, gnat-sized issues I have with it that all, by the time the run's over, I'm like, God, I just want to put the controller down. I'm going to be done with this game.
I'm not going to name names, but I was watching someone the other day who was doing a stream where they were just scrolling through the AGDQ 2021 game submissions, and they saw Blaster Master, and I don't know what their history is with Blaster Master, but they're like, how many times has this been in the event? And they went to GDQ VODs and searched it. So that was kind of funny. I don't know. I think it's a fine. Honestly, for me, who's not too much into NES stuff, I think that's one of the better ones to watch. But again, haven't played it, so I can't talk from that perspective.
It is a cool run to watch. Like I said, I mean, I even enjoy watching it, and I don't like to play it. And the thing is like, there are so many cool things about it. Like, the music is good. Like, it's got varying styles of gameplay. But for me, there's just some weird disconnect. Like, it doesn't line up, and every time I play it, I just walk away frustrated.
What is your favorite controller?
Ooh. I could lie and say the N64 controller just because I feel like I'm answering the worst controller question. Honestly, I think it depends on what I'm doing. I love the NES controller. I think there's something almost perfect about it. Rectangle or dog bone, whichever one you want to use. I prefer the brick. It's simple. It's responsive. Like, I take it apart, I clean it every so often, and it bounces back just fine. I love it for its simplicity. I think is that I sometimes joke with some of my friends have started to have kids, and I joke with them. I was like, how are they going to learn to play video games? Because when I was a kid, I learned on the NES, and that had a D-pad, select, start, A and B. But you hand a little kid now a modern control, like an Xbox or a PlayStation controller. There's like 50 buttons on that thing. Like, I get overwhelmed sometimes, and I'm well versed in this stuff. So, like, where do you go? And it just feels like it's the NES controller really feels to me like the very first, like, really good implementation of a controller that's really solid and works on all levels.
So does that mean that the N64 is your least favorite?
I mean, maybe that's unfair. I think it's a cool idea. I think it's a cool idea. I might honestly say the GameCube controller, because I hate that C-stick.
Ooh,
and
wow.
that's another one that, like, I feel like I am delivering some hot takes that are probably gonna, like, there are probably people that are like, Mega, what are you saying? How dare you? But I mean, I just, like, I don't like the triggers. I'm literally holding it in my hand now. I don't like the L and R buttons. They feel kind of funky to me. That little C trigger or C thing is kind of wonky.
It has the worst D-pad. Like, I don't. Yeah, like, and I say that knowing that I have a 360 controller, which has that floaty D-pad, which is terrible. But, like, no, tiny D-pad is worse.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have especially large hands, and I like that D-pad is like, I can't push only one direction on that. It does not feel good. It might have to be the GameCube controller, though. I'll admit I really don't like the PS4 controller either.
It sits in your hands weird, right?
It does.
Why does the? It's so bulbous on the ends, and I don't know why.
I'm much more like I really like the Xbox One controller. especially if you've ever had a chance to use the Elite controller. Like that's as far as a modern controller goes. Yeah, as far as a modern controller goes, like I don't think I've ever held anything better. But like I think about that versus like the PlayStation 4 controller. I was like, why? Like you take away the paddles, and I think the triggers aren't as good, and like I don't know. It's again, I feel like these are in stark contrast to what certainly the Kotaku message boards would have me believe. But
I mean, people have their takes. It's interesting what sticks with people and what doesn't. But let's talk about some games. Let's and I think the focus here too is I really want to get sort of to your interest, your history with the particular games that we're gonna run over here quickly. Obviously, we've already talked a bit about Metal Storm. You had done it at SGDQ 2020 online. We talked a little bit about why you like it, why you consider it your favorite run. What's your personal history with the game? Because I know this game, folks, if you're not familiar with Metal Storm, this is a game that has, I believe, North American and Japanese versions from the NES that are very different. And then much more recently, I think last year, 2019, there was a re-release of basically a proper, based on what you described in the SGD commentary, it sounds like a proper actual release. They kept the lore. They didn't switch out so much of the color palettes. Seems like a real true proper English language release for this game. Had you played this game in its original North American version, or is this something you came to just recently?
So I came to this game. This was a game that after I started speedrunning, I'd seen it once or twice on VODs, and I was like, that's a game that I know I'm going to love as soon as I play it. Metal Storm is one of the few games that I speedrun that I did not play as a kid. And there's a group, they're called Retro Games Racing, and they do, like, every month they pick a game, it's voted on by the group, and everybody learns it and they race it, and then, next month the same thing happens. I haven't done a ton of races with them, but Metal Storm was one where I was like, oh yeah, you guys are doing Metal Storm, I'm going to hop in. That's an excuse to learn this game. And you pilot you control this big mech, and the idea, like there really isn't a story in the US version of it, which funny enough came out before the Japanese version. Usually the Japanese version of NES games are released first before the US version. The US Metal Storm came out first. And there's a little bit of story in the manual, but the overarching idea is that this AI, we've basically turned Pluto into Starkiller Base, which is just more proof that there was literally nothing unique about The Force Awakens. That idea was done in Metal Storm in the early 90s, so that's it's always a retread. But this Pluto base blows up a planet, and then it decides that it's going to blow up Earth, and so they send your mech, the M308 gunner, in to set the self-destruct sequence off. And it has a little bit of weapon changing, but it's really about flipping gravity. So everywhere you go, you can flip the gravity back and forth as you move throughout the stages. And it creates some really cool platforming that just, I can't think of another NES game or really any game off the top of my head that has that same kind of mechanic that is so heavily baked in at all stages that it's absolutely necessary everywhere you go, that you're going to be flipping gravity to dodge enemies and to attack things. It's just really, really neat. So I came to it through that sequence, and I learned the any% run, which is a little different than the GDQ run I did. The GDQ run doesn't have any wrong warps. The US version, what's really cool about it is that if you take damage on the same frame, that you pick up an armor, which gives you an extra hit. Normally, if you get hit once, you die. But if you pick up armor, you have 2 hits. If you pick up armor and get hit on the same frame, it kicks you to the end of that stage. Which is super awesome, and it saves a ton of time. But they fixed that in the Japanese version, and so obviously on the re-release that came out last year, that was already fixed.
Right. So again, just to clarify, make sure I'm understanding right, when you were doing this racing group, you were learning the original American version before this re-release version came out.
Right. And so that was so we learned the any percent route, which allows for those wrong warps. There's a total of 5 in the game. I've only ever gotten a run that has 3 of them, and it's but mechanically, the game was one that I always knew I was going to love. And I think what ultimately settled it down as one of my all-time favorite titles is once this re-release happened, it kind of came up to another level because I loved it and I loved to play it and I thought it was super cool mechanically. But then I come to find out that like there's like a legitimate message in this game that was trying to be shared, when it was released. And so I just want to read real quick the ending screens, if you don't mind. It's the Earth was saved from catastrophe, and yet will not man learn. Humanity's history has been wrought with strife. Who can tell if mankind will ever embrace its cosmic mother instead of harming her? If mankind does not change, it might be better if they were wiped out. Each of us must do our part to bring peace and love to all living things in the universe. And like, that's heavy, but I love that there was a game in like the early 90s on the NES, even if I didn't get to see it back then, and even if it wasn't there in the US version, that and I know that there were other NES games like this, but like it's the one that to me, like, I loved it mechanically, and then I come to find out that it's got this depth that the original developers was like, humanity is, there's a reason why this AI took a look at Earth and was like, hey, you know what? Maybe I should wipe these guys out. Like this isn't great, and I think that there's this feeling of, I think it's really clear. It's like, embrace the planet, take care of itself, take care of Earth, and take care of each other. And I think that that's a good message, and I really appreciate that. And when you marry it to something that's just super fun to play and cool to look at, I mean, I think that's going to hit me. That's a critical strike to a lot of my personal beliefs and feelings. So it really hits home, I think, and I just love it for all of those reasons.
Yeah, I think it's really cool to have something like that provides an insight to what was on the minds of the people working on the game as well. I feel like that especially gives you a clue what's going on. That even though it might seem like it's hard to communicate through things through the limited palette of an NES game, but it's still there. It's still a part of the fabric of what's going on. Let's keep moving. How about Shadows of the Empire? I'm willing to bet that was a childhood game. Oh,
it most certainly was. It definitely was, and that was one that I picked up. I actually forget why I picked up Shadows of the Empire, but it's the only 3D game that I run currently. Everything else I do is 2D. It's based on, basically Super Nintendo or Genesis or earlier. Very little that I run is newer than that. But Shadows of the Empire was a game I played a lot as a kid. I mean, I love Star Wars, and I love that game because I played the heck out of it and did everything you could do in it. And it was so cool because it was part of this massive like push by Lucasfilm at the time to like create another movie out of thin air without a movie. There was a book, there was a comic, there was this game, there were action figures, like all of this stuff was released all at the same time. So I was at like the perfect age where it's like, oh yeah, I got to get my Dash Rendar, action figure, and I want to play the video game. And I read the book, and all of this stuff just kind of happened at the right time. And I was thinking about N64 games that I could, learn and I could play. And, the first one I thought of was actually GoldenEye. And let me tell you, GoldenEye I don't think holds up very well. I think it holds up pretty terribly. In fact, it doesn't have the twin sticks, and I think that for any FPS, that's almost a necessity if you're going to play it on a controller these days. Going backwards for that, I think, is the hardest thing for me. I just can't do it. My brain won't let me. But the way that Dash Rendar aims in Shadows of the Empire, you really don't, like, the aiming mechanics are such that you don't really need that second stick. Like, it's got a strong enough auto aim that you can just kind of wander around and not worry about it. And so,
yeah, it's interesting watching it because it has that sort of feel of like the older, like almost like pseudo 3D games like a Wolfenstein or Doom, where it's doing a little bit of that up and down aiming for you.
Right. It really does. And again, I think it's a cool story in and of itself. It's set between Empire and Jedi, and you get to play as not Han Solo, which is, I think, the easiest way to describe Dash Rendar. They're like, okay, Han Solo's in Carbonite. Who can you play as? Well, how about we give you a Corellian that has a freighter and is a smuggler, and he's kind of roguish. It's like, all right, there you go. That's our guy. And so it just fits this weird place. But again, you're still shooting stormtroopers. You're still dealing with TIE fighters. And it opens with the Battle of Hoth, which I think is actually one of the best, especially at the time, I think was a pretty perfect experience in terms of the Battle of Hoth, like taking down the AT-ATs and everything. It's just, it was one of those games that as a kid, I was like, I love this because it's all the Star Wars stuff that I want to do. And it wasn't like Rogue Squadron where you were only flying. Like, you got to fly a bit, you got to be on the ground. The only thing you didn't get to be was a Jedi, and to a certain extent, I don't. That's fine. I was always more of a Han Solo kid, anyways. So I didn't need the lightsaber.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear you. I definitely I know even in the Star Wars games that I did play, your Dark Forces or Masters of Terrascasi, who can forget?
Oh no.
You kind of like certain things. The one thing I wanted to highlight from this run, but before moving on, was how do you feel? Because it seems like the most showcased tech in this game is that once you get the jetpack, you can do this clipping where you're able to position Dash sort of just straight horizontally laid out sideways, and then that allows you to push him through ceilings. And it seems like a little difficult to get working right away. Do you like it? I mean, it looks great. It's hilarious 3D, but like, how is that for you as the runner?
Honestly, I've had a few runs where I just could not get it to work. Like, it would work the first time in one of the sections where you can do it, and then it just wouldn't the next time, and I just constantly banging Dash up against the ceiling. But it doesn't feel too bad. But I personally love it because it lets you skip some relatively dull sequences in the game. And one of the things that the more I've speedrun, the more I come around on the idea that it really should be, exciting as much as possible. And like I said, it lets you skip some really boring sequences. So the first time you can do it after you get the jetpack, it basically lets you skip from a sort of mid-boss fight against an AT-ST. You don't even have to fight that thing. You can just go immediately to Boba Fett. And that's cool because everything that you skip there is all just like walking through tunnels and taking an elevator. Like, there's really not much interesting that's there. So you cut out a whole bunch of boring stuff. And it also offers the opportunity for some comedy, because when you flip Dash on his side, the game considers him falling. Whether he's going up or down, it considers him falling. So if you do it wrong, you can actually get the jetpack set up so that you turn it off, and instead of him flying straight up, he just like falls straight down, and it doesn't matter how far he falls, it'll kill him because it thinks that he's been falling for like 20 seconds, and so as soon as he contacts the ground, he dies, which is kind of funny.
I think you did it at least once so I watched, in preparation for this, I had watched the Retrothon 2020 VOD, and I believe that happened at least once, and it was in fact pretty funny.
Yeah, that sounds about right. That run was very impromptu. there was a hole in the schedule, and they somebody had to drop out at the last minute, and I'm part of the mod team for RGL, and one of the admins came on and was like, is anybody got like an hour game that they could like play for this and fill in? I was like, well, I got Shadows if you guys want that. They're like, absolutely, do it. So
do it.
So super rusty run, but it's like I said, it's funny. Like even when it goes wrong, it's like, oh, here's Dash. He fell all of 5 feet and he just and then he's dead.
Yeah,
which is pretty amusing.
Turned into a puddle. Yeah. So what happened there, Dash? What did you do? All right, let's get on to the last one. Check in on now. You mentioned earlier that the 2 runs that you did at SGDQ 2020 Online were, of course, Metal Storm, and then also new Ghostbusters 2, which is not to be confused with the run we're going to talk about, which is Ghostbusters 2.
I have to say, I actually feel kind of bad that I made you watch this run. This is one of those ones that I actually wonder how much fun it can be for somebody to watch, because if you've never played it, you don't know how absolutely absurd that game is. And
well, I mean, I tell you, I've never watched it before, and I'm watching it, and the thing that stuck out to me was the fact that the Ectomobile was doing what appeared to me a Battletoad sequence. Like, what? Why?
Yeah, so this really dives back into I loved this game when I was a kid, right? And so when I started the speedrun, this was like the first game I did for a 12-hour challenge. I was like, okay, I'm going to learn Ghostbusters 2 because I never could beat it as a kid, so I want to beat it. And so I picked it up, and I had the save states, and I kind of taught myself how it works. But it's funny because, in a normal NES game, you jump with A and you shoot with B. That game, you jump with B and you shoot with A. Normally, you run from the left to the right of the screen. In that game, you run from the right to the left. It's weird little things that it does kind of wonky. And it doesn't have any idea what it wants to be. It has like these dime store contra sections where you're actually on foot as a Ghostbuster, and then it puts you in Ecto 1 where it is kind of like a bad hyper tunnel or turbo tunnel from Battletoads, where like you're trying to like dodge the ghosts and move back and forth. And fun fact, there's like you have to run over these arrows to give you a super boost so that you can make it over jumps, and makes no sense whatsoever. And then you have like these shmup sections where you control the Statue of Liberty, and so like it's just all over the place as to what kind of a game it is. And it has a real soft spot in my heart because I like I said, I think of myself to a certain extent as a speedrunner. Like if I was going to categorize myself, I'd think of myself as I play a lot of retro garbage. I play a lot of what you could argue are kind of bad old 16 8-bit games, and I would absolutely put Ghostbusters 2, the Activision US release, in that list. It is it's just a retro garbagey game, but it's funny, and I love the Ghostbusters. So I mean, that's the big thing for me, is I got to play as one of my heroes as a kid. So
it's interesting to bring up the whole subject of licensed games and how our fondness for them doesn't match up with critical reception. Like, for example, I looked up what the critical reception was for this game at the time it was released, and it was mixed to negative. Yeah. I would say is what I found.
Sounds right.
But yeah, but still, regardless of that, we enjoy things that we relate to or have other fondness for, and so this is a vehicle for that, and so it's funny to see it now. To me, watching this, I didn't see anything that jumped out at me as specifically speedrun tech. Is there anything that you would want to point out, being like, this is something that really isn't intended or otherwise we're able to really exploit?
So the big thing is, and it's something that I've actually been working on a little bit more recently, to really try to push this game, because this is like, if you look if the leaderboard for this, it's a ghost town. It's like myself, I think it's Tristan, and then a run that Toad did like 12 years ago. So that it's a ghost town, and I always try to tell people like it's not a hard speedrun to pick up because it really is pretty execution based. There's like you can get a good time in it just if you beat it because the game doesn't let you pause, it doesn't let you stop. You need to always be moving anyways. So it's kind of a nice friendly speedrun entry point. But if there is one place where you can really save a lot of time, it's the Statue of Liberty shmup sections. What you really want to do there is you want to try to take damage to prevent the bonus rounds so that those don't happen. But then you're also taking away lives from yourself later, so you have to be tighter in the last stage in the museum. So, and really, once you get to that final stage with Venkman, you're actually taking intentional hits on a few places because there's just so many enemies that getting through them any other way is obscenely slow. So you're actually like throwing a trap and then jumping into enemies so that you get hurt while the trap sucks up a bunch of bad guys. So that once your iframes have worn off, you can get moving again. So those are the big things. So it's really just a health management and like almost like you're trading your speed for your health, but you're doing it in a stage that isn't directly tied to where you're sacrificing that health per se. But that's the big one, and I think that it's a game that I've messed around a bit with trying to find out if there's any way to like skip things or like I can't even soft lock it. Like there's really not a lot there. It seems like it's simple enough that there's not a ton of real ways to really break it, which is almost too bad because I think that if you could break it, it would actually probably be it would also be really neat to see what you could do there.
I have this conversation with Casey Frew a lot where we're playing some bad game and we're really frustrated that we can't break it. and I always remind him the sad truth is that in order to find exploits, you must have features. And if there are no features, there's nothing you can do.
I think that's a really good way to describe Ghostbusters 2, to be honest, because it has very basic gameplay for the three different types of game that you play, and it does it relatively competently, but it doesn't introduce anything super fascinating that lets you really break anything. Like I said, it's really okay, I want to try to get hit by this thing, not so much that I take a life that it takes a life, but enough that it does enough damage so that I don't deal with this extra bonus thing that I don't want because it takes time. And so I've been messing with that, trying to figure out like the best way to sort that. And it's like trying to fit together a really annoying puzzle that sort of changes every time you move one piece around. So it's definitely on my list of things. I'd like to go back and push that game further down, but nobody else runs it, so it's almost a labor of love on my side, and it's like it can wait until someone challenges me.
It's an interesting routing problem, especially considering that, the tighter you route it, the more difficult it becomes to execute the route. And then it's also, where's the motivation coming from, which is definitely understandable. Let's start winding things down. Well, one of the things that I like to do to connect the interviews together is to get a question from my previous guest for my next guest, and so forth, and to link them together. Now, my previous guest was Amber, the Mario Kart 8 DX runner, and she had this question. I used to restrict these to gaming and speedrunning, but 2 interviews ago, my guest rebelled against me, and so now it is broad. It's going to be a speedrunner answering it, so take that into account. But this question is for you, from Amber, which is, what's your favorite genre of movie?
That's. Oh God, I'm so not prepared for that kind of question. Oh wow. Honestly, I think that it would probably have to be like I'm just trying to think of my all-time favorite movies, and it so often comes to like a comedy. Like I I still think of the first Ghostbusters is like very formative for me. Even the second one for that matter. And like, Mel Brooks, Young Frankenstein and Spaceballs. So, I mean, honestly, I might have to say comedy just because I will always go back to those, no matter what. If I'm having a bad day, I can put one of those on and it's like, okay, this is better. Like, even an action movie, which I love action movies. I love Die Hard's one of my favorite movies and things like that, but like, there's still like some downers to those to a certain extent. At least like with a comedy, I know that it's kind of a happy ending. And these days I think I kind of need that a little more in my media, like a positive message, or at least everybody gets to go home happy at the end. So that's probably where I gotta go.
No, that's extremely fair. That does mean though that I do need from you, for my next guest, a question.
How about I would have originally restricted this to video games, but because I was asked a movie question, I think that I'm going to broaden this. Is if you could resurrect one franchise, originally it would be a game franchise, but any franchise now, what franchise would you resurrect and bring back? And I kind of think that's on my mind because Mega Man 11 was only about, a year and a half old now. And like that, it had been, a decade since a Mega Man game had been released. And so to have that come back feels really good. So it's like, okay, what other what franchise would you bring back to, if you had the ability to resurrect a dormant franchise?
See, this is always exciting for me, and I say this is because I already know who the next person is, and I'm gonna give you the DM. This is who's gonna get that question, and I think they're gonna have a pretty good answer for that. So that should be nice. Now I know we've been really, really focused on old stuff for old people, and are there games coming out in the future, in the next year or so that you're really interested that you've been following?
Oh yeah, I still play a lot of stuff casually. My speedrunning is really retro focused, but I game a lot, and I play a lot of modern stuff, even if I don't stream it. And I've loved the Resident Evil franchise, and I'm very excited for Village. That's one that keeps popping up on my radar, just because I think we get to see more Chris Redfield, and I'm always down to see more Chris. In any game. I mentioned Xbox and Halo earlier. I know that the trailer for Halo Infinite was much maligned as it looked terrible, but I don't care. I mean, if it's Halo, I will play it. There's something about that franchise that I think it hit me at the right age where I'm always going to love it no matter what. So I'm definitely interested in Infinite. Oh, geez, what else is... There's so much good stuff coming out. There's the new Amnesia that's being that's being released. I like horror games, actually, is just a genre I enjoy, in it is to play casually, and so those always are high on my list. So those are probably the ones that I think the most of. I'm sure there's other stuff, but I right now, I'm just waiting for everything to come out. I've been playing Squadrons, the new Star Wars game, which is super fun. Flying an X-Wing or an A-Wing or a TIE fighter around. It makes you feel like a kid again, So,
are you one of those flight stick people?
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Okay.
I was when I was in college, you asked the question about multiplayer. My freshman year, I was on a floor of all engineering dudes. And so obviously you're surrounded by just a bunch of nerds, of which I am 100% one of. And so we played Counter-Strike, and one of the things we got into was one of the Star Wars flight sim games, and like everybody on the whole floor went out and we all bought our really nice Logitech, flight sticks, and, so we're all flying our X-Wings around, and we're on Ventrilo with call signs and stuff. It was super nerdy and geeky, but that was, Like,
I mean, that's what you did.
Yeah, that's and now I'm content to use the controller, but if I really get into it, I might have to invest in the flight stick. I won't lie, it feels like it would work real well.
All right, where should people find you, and what should they be on the lookout for?
Well, I'm everywhere that I have. Sorry, everywhere that I am. I'm pretty sure it's MadMegaX381. Which is a bit of a mouthful, I know, but that's on Twitter, Twitch. My YouTube is just like a string of letters, but all it shows are my current PBs and runs like that. So I wouldn't even necessarily worry about that. But Twitter and Twitch are the places where I'm at, and I've been away from Twitch for a little bit. I finished GDQ and was like, I kind of want to take a break for a little bit. I was really banging on some games in preparation for that. But I'm planning to come back. I want to work on Metal Storm a little more, especially the No Wrong Warp run that I did at GDQ. I want to do that on the US version because it's a little faster. I want to try to get a new PB in that, and I'm thinking that I might try to branch out into something a little more modern. There's a game that's been kind of in the back of my mind running around. It's called White Knight. And it is a game that was released relatively recently, but it's black and white only. And it's kind of a survival puzzle horror kind of game, kind of in the vein of the early Resident Evil games, just no weapons. And it's all black and white, so the way that the graphics look is really cool to me when you have that very stark, different color. It's kind of like an Obra Dinn idea of how it's presented. And that one's been rattling around in my head for probably a year and a half now of like, I'd really like to try to do that. And so if I can ever, like, I'm almost saying it now because now I feel like if it's out in the world, I'll have to hold myself to doing it. Because it's such a cool looking game, and there isn't even a page for it on speedrun.com. Like, nobody has touched it. It's completely, as far as I'm aware, undiscovered country, and I've never done a game like that before. So I think that would be the next way to further my speedrunning career, is to take something that nobody's touched yet and really plant a flag someplace.
Yeah, asking those kinds of basic questions can be a lot of fun. I've had a few opportunities with that when spelunking around the PlayStation 1 library, so it is very good. And for, of course, all those links, Twitch, Twitter, they'll be wherever y'all are listening. You can look in the description. You can find links. You can also, I'll put the links to some of the videos I watched as well, the Metal Storm SGDQ, Ghostbusters 2 from Next Level Speedrun Showcase, etc. They'll be in the description as well. MadMega, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of these weird old games that I think to a certain extent, especially with Ghostbusters and Shadows, I don't think a lot of people remember them as fondly as maybe they should. So really appreciate the chance to talk about them.
No, I love weird old stuff, so I'm always happy to amplify that. But I do need one more thing from you before we end the podcast, which is that I'm going to say a cheesy phrase like, let's boost on out of here. And when I do that, I need you to give me your best rocket engine noise.
Okay, I think I can do that.
All right, folks, thank you so much for listening. Let's boost on out of here.